Okay, cool. Hello. Hello. I guess next slide. So it's not the so today, like I mentioned earlier, I'm actually a third year HBS major. Um, Today I'm going to be talking about the Marshall Islands and the nuclear testing that happened there, as well as the origins of Bikini Bottom from SpongeBob. So next slide. So these are just some of my positionalities that may affect my viewpoints or like create inherent biases that I have. So I'm not going to read them all out, but there they are. And something that I also like to do is do an acknowledgement of land. As someone who lives in America, the land on which we do not own. In fact, it is where I am at least. I like to acknowledge the Miwok people as the traditional custodians of the land on which I stand. And I want to recognize their continuing contributions to the land, the water, and the community in which I exist, and pay respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. That's just acknowledging who owns the land where I am. Next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to intro with like, in high school, I read this article for my AP Lang class, and it was called The Clan of One-Breasted Woman by Terry Tempest Williams. And this story is obviously like very kind of a dense reading because it's for AP Lang. But the gist of it was that it was about a woman and her family, and all the women in her family who were exposed to radioactive fallout from nuclear testing in Nevada. And her family ended up getting cancer, many of whom passed away due to the radioactive exposures. And the next slide, or like click next. And you might be thinking, do y'all hear something like this has nothing to do with the Marshall Islands? Well, next slide. I'll get back to how this connects to the Marshall Islands, but it's important to know that between 1951 and 1992, the United States conducted over 1,000 nuclear tests in the Nevada desert on like American soil. Like that's something to recognize. Yes, shout out to Henry's home state. Next slide. So I'm gonna be kind of throwing a lot of information at you at the beginning because I know this is a topic that a lot of people don't really know about. So just a little bit about background information about the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands are a country in the Pacific Ocean, and they are part of Micronesia. Technically, they're an associated state with the United States. So that means they receive some benefits from the US and they receive aid from them as well. The Marshall Islands consist of 29 atolls, which is basically just like a ring-shaped island spread across 700,000 nautical square miles. So that's bigger than the size of California in terms of like all the land that is like owned by the Marshall Islands, but the actual land area is only about the size of Washington, D.C. So super small in terms of like the places where people can live. And in the 1900s, the Marshall Islands were occupied and colonized by American troops from 1944 to 1947. Prior to that, they were colonized by Japan. And then the Marshall Islands gained independence from the United States, establishing itself as its own country in 1968. And also, fun fact in case anyone ever wants to travel to the Marshall Islands, I believe that the flight there is over 30 hours long, and there's only one outgoing commercial flight hosted by United Airlines to go to the Marshall Islands. So good luck to anyone trying to get out there. Next slide. And then here's what happened in the United States and what the United States did in the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1958. The United States detonated 67 nuclear weapons on Bikini Atoll, one of the islands, part of the Marshall Islands, with some blasts over 100 times as strong as powerful as the bombs dropped in Hiroshima. It's also kind of worth mentioning that 33 of the 67 bombs were detonated between April 28th and August 18th, 1958. So in less than 1 year, more than half of the nuclear weapons tested in the Marshall Islands were detonated then. One test in particular was called the Castle Bravo test. And that one was the one that was like way stronger than the blast of Hiroshima. And it caused ash to be spread all over the neighboring regions. And hundreds of Marshallese residents had to be evacuated from their homes because of all the nuclear fallout. But that's not the only thing that United States tested in the Marshall Islands. In fact, they shot ballistic missiles from California, and they also tested biological warfare in the Marshall Islands as well. So kind of a lot of new military testing going on in these islands while the United States owned and occupied the region. Also worth mentioning is that at the time, 167 Bikinians were removed from their homes so that they could drop bombs on Bikini Atoll, and they could no longer return to their homes because of the radiation levels there. Many of them ended up getting cancer, having to have their thyroids removed because of all the radioactive material that they were exposed to. And of these 167, currently there are 29 still surviving. And then next slide. So it's not like the US just dropped a ton of bombs and then just left it there. They cleaned up, they did some cleaning up. So what they did at the time, there's evidence showing that soldiers, and they pushed radioactive material into the lagoon, just straight into the water. But the main thing that they did to clean up was they created what's called the tomb, also known as the Runit Dome. On the left of the slide, you can kind of see some pictures of it. It's this big concrete crater that's just sitting there around like the Enowatok Atoll. Sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation of that, but the tomb was created in one of the craters created by a nuclear bomb, and it was filled with debris and radioactive soil and a whole bunch of like military pieces that were radioactive, and then it was covered up with concrete. And the whole point of this was to basically contain all of the radioactive material that was left over from the military testing. In addition to this, because of all the damages that the United States caused to the area, they agreed to pay the Marshall Islands $2.3 billion in a tribunal. Also worth noting is that the United States has apparently only paid $4 million out of these $2.3 billion. And recently, like a separate contractor analyzed this and found that, yes, the United States like definitely still owes the Marshall Islands like over $1 billion worth of money. And then the final thing that the United States did was basically sign this compact giving the Marshall Islands independence. So then next slide. I'm going to go over sort of more that compact that the United States signed with the Marshall Islands. This gave the Marshall Islands independence from the US in 1986. But because like the Marshall Islands is still associated with the United States, part of like what was in this compact was that the Marshallese could enter, live, and work in the United States with a visa as long as the US could maintain control of Marshallese waters and have a military base. So the military base is at what is called Kwajalein Atoll. Again, I might be really butchering that pronunciation, but they still have a military base there. And then the most important part of this compact is that when the US signed it, they said, we're no longer responsible for whatever happens to the tomb. We cleaned up the radioactive material. We did what we had to do, but anything that happens to it now, that's not us. That's on the Marshall Islands. But of course, like I mentioned, like the United States did agree to pay like a cash settlement because of all the damages that were caused to everyone there. And I believe that now Marshallese residents, like who were from Bikini, they get money from the US government. They get about $150 like 4 times a year from the US government, like as like kind of reparations for that. And then in 1996, the Marshall Islands, they used to have access to Medicaid, but that was taken away and they no longer have access to Medicaid in the Marshall Islands. But it's sort of worth noting, I guess, that like anyone who immigrates from the Marshall Islands to the United States can get healthcare under the Affordable Care Act, but they can't qualify for Medicaid. So with all this kind of background information in mind, I have some questions on the next slide that I'd love to go into breakout rooms for. So one is like, what narratives did the US government paint about the Marshallese when choosing the Marshall Islands as a testing site? And like, what does that say for future military testing and US occupations of foreign lands? 2, is there a justification for the US military presence in Micronesia that still exists today, like before and after this? And then how can the harms caused to these indigenous communities be rectified and who is responsible? I'll also send these in the chat. Okay, I guess since like most people are back now, does anyone have any comments like that they want to make about these questions? Like either in the chat or out loud?
I was talking about this in the breakout room, but last year we were given a topic on like our debate team that was basically about nukes. And one of the ways the US government like justified the problem, kind of tying into like the first question you asked, was they said like, oh, like we need to make sure these nukes like work because it'll be good in the long run. Like we'll save more lives in the long run and we'll hurt less people in the long run. But like that kind of shows discrimination on one side, I was saying, because they don't value the lives of like the Marshallese people. They only value the lives of the people that they think they will be saving in the long run, like not the lives of the people on this small island that even though it is small, there's still people. That doesn't make their lives like completely useless. So I think that's one of the ways that they justified it, that kind of playing like devil's advocate, but like in the long run, like I don't think that's a justification for anything like testing nukes on human beings.
I completely agree. I also see that Garima, you raised your, I can't tell if it's like raising your hand. Someone raised their hand, but I
I
don't know
did
where
not
they
raise
were
my
now.
hand.
Okay. But like going off of like the point that you made, it's also kind of like you test 67 bombs. Like how many bombs do you need to test before you know that like they're not working anymore or like
Yeah,
they
exactly.
okay, now I see raised hands. Okay, Shreya.
I guess one of the things that it kind of reminded me of was like that whole thing, like the justification that like Europeans used when they were colonizing the US was like the idea of terra nullius, where they were like, oh, like indigenous people don't count as people. So like we're able to come and like take this land because they don't own it. And like in the same way, like it kind of feels like that because like they just assume that people didn't live on these islands, or like if they knew, they didn't care enough to like, you know what I mean? So they just were like, oh, we can just do whatever we want with it, which is kind of messed up.
Yeah, hiking messed up, especially like just because it's like yes, it's a ton of ocean and like a relatively small land size compared to it. Like they had to move, like forcibly remove like 100 people from the area, and like now they can never return to their homes. Alice, I also see your hand raised.
Yeah, this is kind of related to what Sarah said about like the justification behind it, but it's also just thinking about the fact that the US is testing like these military weapons. So essentially what they're doing is preparing for war, but they're killing people in the present in order to prepare to kill more people during the war or whichever war that they are preparing for. So it's like the cycle that like just doesn't end, and it's clear whose lives they value more.
Yeah, I see more hands. Okay, I think I have time for it too. So I guess, um, Maida, do you want to go? I don't know, Maida, did you put your hand down? Roshni, do you want to go? Oh, wait.
You can go.
Okay, Roshni.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, this is a little bit about what Sarah was talking about earlier, which is like the US constantly uses the justification that like doing X thing will be really good for us in the long run, because you'll get like some arbitrary benefit. Um, and I've read a lot of stuff about how like even because you can use that justification for anything that you do, and then you can just keep putting off doing the right thing for an infinite amount of time by always saying that it'll be good in the long run, or like the small loss here will get made up for, which is just like the justification that the US has been using for hundreds of years to do like all sorts of nonsense. So yeah, I just like at some point you just have to stop, and I think that time came a long time ago. But yeah, that's usually the lens through which I look at these kinds of things.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also just like the idea that we have yet to see like the outcome, the positive outcomes from this. And like, I don't think anyone wants to see the outcomes from this because who wants to see like a nuclear like war breakout? So like we tested this, but then it's like we hope to never at the same time never use like what we tested. And then I don't know if it's Henry or Sunny that wants to talk, but okay.
Hi. Yeah, so we were also just talking about how like even if I mean, I know the US like did not even give them any money still, but like there's no amount of money that can really pay back like what they did, just also because like the fact that they were testing these like nuclear bombs on their island also killed like, you know, so many endemic species and just like ruined the environment. And also like even if they were to test it in the water, it's like you're killing so much marine life, and also like even adding to ocean acidification that ultimately like also affects these people. So it's like there really is no way to pay back these people since their lives and like were taken away. So it's really insane.
Yeah, and then also Alice commented like paying reparations essentially puts a value on human life, and like how can you say like how much life how much is someone's life worth? So I guess like moving on to the next slide. So a lot of this is like what was happening in history, but there's a lot of changes happening right now, and like a lot of things that could change in the future. So there's this great piece, like my whole this great piece in investigative journalism by Suzanne Rust from the LA Times. And she found, like her and her team found that the US hid key information about the tomb and its nuclear test when they were making that deal that absolved them for any kind of responsibility for the tomb. And remember how I read that essay that was about like atomic bomb testing in the Nevada deserts? Well, it turns out the US took the soil from those Nevada tests and they shipped it to the Marshall Islands, and they put it in the tomb. So they moved radioactive waste from the US to the Marshall Islands in order to like get rid of it and cover it up. And like the Marshallese had no idea that that happened when they signed that compact. So there's this whole new like finding that was like not included in that deal whatsoever. Meanwhile, at the same time, there's so much climate change happening in the region. I mean, climate change happening all over the world, of course, but climate change also happening in this region because the tomb, it was designed to essentially protect the Marshallese like from radioactive material, but now it's cracking and leaking radioactive material into the ocean, and the ocean levels are rising. So now water is just like sloshing over the top of it. In fact, there was recently a day where over 1,000 dead fish washed up on the islands, like on the shores of the Marshall Islands. So there's been like increased disease, like in humans as well, like all kinds of unhealthy changes, loss of biodiversity. But then at the same time, the compact that they signed is coming to an end in 2023. So there's like a lot that can happen when that whole compact that's absolved the US from responsibility and like where the US stated, oh, we're gonna like pay like for what happened, that's coming to an end. But like there's a lot of things that kind of go into that, and whether the Marshall Islands like wants to renegotiate like what happened in the contract. The US like technically Marshallese Island, like a lot of Marshallese youth are able to travel to the United States to get an education, and they're able to do that because like they have special visa status, and they're able to be granted Pell Grants. But the thing is, if the compact ends, then they can no longer, like Marshallese youth can no longer be eligible for the Pell Grant. So there are some benefits like for the Marshallese being a part of the compact because it allows like their youth to have access to higher education. And most of the people that immigrate like to the US for education often don't immigrate back to the Marshall Islands afterwards. So there is like kind of a stake for the Marshall Islands to like continue the compact when it ends in 2023. And then other than that, like the US has also incentive, like the US could just be like, we don't want to pay any more of this, like let's get out of this compact. But the thing is the US like wants to extend like their military presence in this region because China is extending its arm into this region as well. And by having a military base here, the US can like reaffirm that it still has its hold like on the Pacific Islands. And the US like right now like really doesn't like China. Like we can see that like Donald Trump is very anti-China, and that he would want to keep his like arm in this region. So like moving on to the next slide. So like as I stated, like the United States stated that it wants to re-sign its compact from 1986 and extend its presence there and to keep its military base. But at the same time, like how should the Marshallese even do that? Should the Marshallese even renegotiate? And like what amendments do you think should be made to the compact, knowing that the US government hid key information about nuclear testing? And like, is a compact or treaty an effective way to fight the climate change occurring in the Marshall Islands? And like, is there another option like to fight the climate change that's happening in this region? And I was thinking that we could just do some like big group discussion about this, just because like I feel like I just dropped, I don't want to say that use the term dropped a bomb because we're talking about literal bombs being dropped on people, but the US hid key information. So like, do you guys think the Marshall Islands should be signed the compact?
I think the first thing that comes to mind, Ashley, when you said like, should they, is not just, it's not a matter of like whether they should or they shouldn't, because the choice isn't something that they can make freely. What you talked about with the Pell Grants, like if there's a great advantage to getting this Pell Grant and coming to the States and receiving an education, possibly improving their socioeconomic status and helping their family or their community, then that becomes very beneficial. And so it's like, yeah, this is something we want to do at the expense of letting a foreign country continue to practice this like modern kind of colonization and extending their like military presence. So it's like, of course they shouldn't, but there's pressure to sign it.
Yeah, of course. And then like also it's not like, I know that the Marshall Islands, like they also receive food aid from the United States as well in forms like, and mostly it's like rice and chicken. But I know that the food, like in this region at least, in terms of like health outcomes, like the number one cause of like the number one disease in this region is not actually like from radioactive like side effects. It's actually like diabetes and obesity. And I know that like the US like gives food aid that isn't really that healthy, but it is food aid like nonetheless. Yeah, it does seem like that everything that the America does to benefit the Marshall Islands actually benefits them. But at the same time, like there have been several countries in this region that have like signed treaties with China instead of the United States, who have cut their diplomatic ties with the US. So like theoretically that could be an option for the Marshall Islands. But like you said, Ashley, like would they want to give up like the chance to get like free education in the United States? Like it's a whole balancing act. And then like, does anyone have anything to say about like climate change or like what should happen like with climate change in this region and like what's happening with that tomb that's leaking radioactive material into the ocean? If not, I think we can move rightly along. Next slide. So most people I'm assuming have watched SpongeBob. I've kind of put a lot of different like SpongeBob memes like into this presentation in order to kind of like slowly get us to the point of Bikini Bottom. So Bikini Bottom is actually based off of Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands, where the nuclear testing happened. If you didn't, I know most people like didn't know that Bikini Bottom was actually based on a real place, but it is because Bikini Atoll is Bikini Atoll is the Anglicized spelling of Bikini Atoll, and the characters from SpongeBob like can literally be thought of as creations from a nuclear disaster. And there have been several episodes of SpongeBob as well that literally like feature videos of like atomic bombs in the ocean. And a lot of people say that's like an actual reference to the like nuclear testing that happened in this region. But a lot of people literally have no idea that Bikini Bottom is based off of stories and narratives that happen in this region. And like this was a topic that I only recently learned about. Like for example, California approved high school textbooks do not include any mention of the Marshall Islands or the US nuclear testing that happened here. So then like, I guess like next slide. So this is a quote like from the LA Times article that I mentioned earlier. It says like, in Los Angeles, you make movies about the Titanic, about people who lost everything. Why don't you make movies about us? And this is from an indigenous Marshallese woman who witnessed the nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. So just like some questions that I have like for another breakout room, I think, to Nathan and Grima. What would justice look like for the Marshallese? And how do shows like SpongeBob SquarePants erase the narratives of the Marshallese? And like what can be done to rectify that erasure? And then what ways should our education and entertainment change to reflect these historical injustices?
But I think one thing when we talk about like representation in like media, when she talks about like movies, I immediately go to like things like Princess and the Frog, where like she was a frog for most of the movie, like the dehumanization of that, and how I feel like that's been mimicked here. Obviously, like I wouldn't even know that SpongeBob was like based off of this. But additionally, in our group, we were just talking about like more than entertainment, our education needs to change. Like if we're supposed to know about the world wars, we should be aware of like how we as the United States messed up, because if anyone is going to criticize our history, it should be us. Anyways, I'm done now.
Yeah, I completely agree, because I think that, like, at least when I remember learning about the world wars, it was like very much like framed in the way like this is what happened and then this is how the United States won. But it never like talked about like what happened, like these people lost so much, but like our education and like everything that's framed about the world wars is like how we like defeated like other countries basically. And then Katie.
Oh yeah, I have something quick to add. So I feel like the fact that they're leaving it out of like American textbooks, and the fact that shows like this are based loosely off of it but don't really hit on the seriousness or like the levity of the situation, kind of like continuously re-traumatizes the future generations of like the people who had experienced the nuclear warfare, who had lived there. Because it's like, oh, we suffered so much, but our voices aren't heard, because they make jokes, they don't talk about us, like especially that woman, I don't know how to say her name, but she's like, oh, they don't even make movies about us, like they don't care about us, like we don't exist, which really sucks, and it's really sad.
Yeah, and I think also in the same way, it's kind of like the Titanic, like it was a tragedy, and like Hollywood is so eager to make tragedies when like it's like concerns sort of like white people, but then when a tragedy happens to like people of color, then like no one wants to focus on it. And also like SpongeBob isn't the only example of like, if anyone has seen Godzilla, like Godzilla is also like the whole monster was created during like supposedly created like because of the bombings in Japan. So like that's not the first, like this SpongeBob is not the first show based on a nuclear disaster in any way. Like it's been like, it's not the first example of like the narratives of people who experience a nuclear tragedy being erased. Does anyone have any other kind of comments about, oh, it's kind of like justification for something that can't be justified? Exactly, like literally, like SpongeBob completely erases like what happened to these individuals, and like I didn't even know, like starting the research for this presentation, that SpongeBob was based off of it. And like it's also sort of goes to the point too that like Bikini Bottom is like Anglicanized as I can't do the pronunciation of that. But like the name of it itself is like already changed to suit white people to begin with. I don't know if anyone else has any other last minute comments they would love to make. Bernie, would you like to explain this link that you just sent?
I was talking about it in my breakout room, but I was like pretty sure that I've watched a documentary on this before. And I don't know, something that came up in our group was kind of how Spongebob Squarepants could be a really useful platform if they angled it the right way instead of, just making it purely comedy. And there are already like documentaries and things that were supposed to be far reaching that just didn't get the impact that it was supposed to have. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any answers either as to how like things should or could or would change, but I hope that unless there's no other comments, like I don't have any other slides, but I hope that my presentation like helped inform you about a topic that you didn't previously know about, because I certainly didn't know about this before, and I hope that everyone's able to take away some new information about a huge historical injustice that happened to the Marshallese people. Anyway, thank you so much for everyone's time.
Right. Thank you, Ashley. Virtual round of applause for Ashley.